Good evening and welcome. My name's Chris Fyke. I'm the publisher at Black Ink. It's my happy duty to introduce Simon Leys this evening. As some of you may know, Simon Leys is the pen name of Pierre Ryckmans. In an ultimately vain effort to conceal his identity, Pierre adopted a nom de plume when writing about China under Mao, and since then the name has stuck. Pierre Ryckmans was born in Belgium and settled in Australia in 1970. For many years he taught Chinese literature and Chinese studies at the Australian National University and the University of Sydney. Alongside this notable academic career, he has led a parallel life as an essayist, critic, translator and man of letters. His writing has appeared in many of the world's great journals of ideas, including the New York Review of Books, the TLS and Le Monde. He has translated Confucius, written a wonderful novella called The Death of Napoleon, exchanged words with Christopher Hitchens, and delivered the ABC's Boyer Lectures, to name just a few things. In all of this various activity, one thing has been constant: a wondrous ability to cut to the essence of things. Whether he's considering totalitarianism or universities, Georges Simenon or George Orwell, one senses in him a scalpel that cuts to the heart of the matter. But it is a scalpel that is wielded lightly and always with a humane regard for the uniqueness of what it encounters. And that's a very rare thing. So when combined with deep learning and a barbed wit, it results in a matchless critic and essayist. Would you please join me in welcoming Pierre Ryckmans to the Wheeler Centre?
Thank you, Chris, for kind words of introduction. It's a great pleasure to meet you all here tonight. Old people giving public lectures run two risks. They may ramble endlessly, or they may lose the thread of their speech. To prevent this double danger, instead of talking, I'm going to read to you the paper I prepared for tonight's talk. This is probably not the best form of delivery, certainly not the form I would have used in my younger days, and I apologize for that. Then a third danger is to repeat oneself. This, however, I cannot avoid. I'm afraid I'm going to repeat one or two things I've already said or published earlier on. But if I still do it, it is because I think it is relevant to my topic. The other day, completely per chance, sorting out old books, I came across a sentence by Rainer Maria Rilke that could provide the best starting point for tonight's talk. To approach works of art, nothing is worse than criticism. Love alone can grasp them, keep them, be fair towards them. This phrase comes from his Letters to a Young Poet, a book I used to worship in my students' day, but which I did not touch again for a good half century. I just said I found it per chance, but if there is one thing one learns in old age, is that chance does not exist. As Bernanos said, chance is the god of morons. Now a warning. I hope you did not come here tonight under the mistaken impression that this talk would deal with contemporary literary theory or academic criticism. I confess that these disciplines are totally foreign to me. I don't even understand their technical language. Postmodernism, structural criticism, deconstructionism, I would be totally unable to explain the meaning of these various notions. I wholeheartedly subscribe to Chekhov's attitude as he explained it in a letter. When I am told what is artistic and inartistic, of realism, commitment and all that, I am baffled. I divide all works into two kinds, those I like and those I don't like. I have no other yardstick, and if you ask me why I like Shakespeare and don't like Zlatoratsky, I shall have no answer. However, I certainly do not wish to debunk these scholarly disciplines. It is always very stupid to debunk something one does not know. Still, to be sincere, I must confess that I have one big reservation towards these academic approaches. I remember one day chatting with a university colleague who was much involved in these higher forms of literary theory, as I naively say that I much admire creative writers for their ability to move readers, to make them laugh, to make them cry. He looked at me with a mixture of astonishment and compassion, for he was a serious scholar. For him, reading was serious work, career. Apparently, it never crossed his mind that the long hours he devoted to his studies would also be occasions to laugh and to cry. In one word, my main objection or suspicion towards a certain type of academic literary scholars is that perhaps some of them do not really enjoy literature. But of course I may be wrong, and forgive me, I'm full of prejudice, as you may soon realize. There is a form of reading that exists before and totally without any attempt at criticism, without any awareness of critical dimension. And there is a form of reading that discards and transcends all critical trappings. These two types of reading may well represent the purest approach to literature. The first type, pre-critical or non-critical reading, is a reading we enjoy in childhood. The second type of pure reading is reached by literate minds or literary men placed in extreme circumstances, where literally a book or the mere memory of a book can save their lives. At such a point, the axiom of the American poet and critic Randall Jarrell is verified. Without literature, human life is animal life. First, childhood reading. Graham Greene wrote a beautiful essay on this subject, The Lost Childhood, in the personal prologue to his collected essays. He makes the point, the truth of which we have all experienced. In a sense, the best readers, the most totally unconditional readers, are the children. There is no critical distance between the child and the book. The reality evoked by the book is beyond question. The surrender of the reader is complete, perfect, absolute. As a consequence, and I quote Greene's word, perhaps it is only in childhood that books have deep influence on our lives. In later life, we admire, we are entertained, we may modify some views we already hold, but we are more likely to find in books merely a confirmation of what is in our minds already. In childhood, all books are books of divination, telling us about the future. What do we get nowadays from reading to equal the excitement and a revelation in those first 14 years of our life. Of course, I shall be interested to learn that a new novel by Mr. E.M. Forster was going to appear this spring, but I could never compare that mild expectation of civilized pleasure with the missed heartbeat, the appalled glee I felt when I found on a library shelf a novel by Rider Haggard, Captain Brereton, or Anthony Hope, which I had not read before. Second form of pure reading, the reading that transcends all criticism. The case of literary minds in extreme circumstance, who find their salvation in reading. In a desperate situation, the written word, or the memory of the written word, can recover its original oracular power and become a lifeline, a key to survival. I already gave examples of this some 15 years ago in a Boyer lecture. Allow me to repeat them here. My first example comes from China. Professor Wu Ningquen was teaching English literature in a Chinese university. In the Maoist era, during one of the savage purges of intellectuals, he was sent for many years to a particularly harsh labor camp in the barren wilderness of northeastern China, close to Siberia. As he eventually recalled in his poignant memoir, A Single Tear, in the camp many inmates were dying of starvation, ill treatment, exhaustion, and sheer despair. To survive in such horrific conditions, physical resilience was not enough. One needed spiritual sustenance. Wu Ningquen found it in poetry. He had succeeded in smuggling with him 2 thin booklets, a collection of the Tang poet Tu Fu, and a copy of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Formerly, he had made critical analysis of Hamlet, but now it seems to him that he was truly reading it for the first time. Occasionally, when a blinding blizzard blew from Siberia and the prisoners had to spend the day cooped up in their barracks, he could come back to Hamlet. He describes it in these words. Hamlet was my favorite Shakespearean play. Read in Chinese labor camp, however, the tragedy of the Danish prince took on unexpected dimensions. All the academic analysis and critiques that had engrossed me over the years now seemed remote and irrelevant. The outcry, Denmark is a prison, echoed with poignant immediacy, and Elsinore loomed like a haunting metaphor of a treacherous repressive state. The ghost thundered with a terrible chorus of 1 million victims of proletarian dictatorship. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern would have felt like fish in the water had they found their way into a modern nation of hypocrites and informers. As to Hamlet himself, his great capacity for suffering gave the noble Dane his unique stature, and as a tragic hero, preeminently worthy of his suffering, I would say to myself, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be, echoing Eliot's Prufrock. Rather, I often felt like one of these fellows crawling between earth and heaven, scorned by Hamlet himself. But the real question I came to see was neither to be or not to be, nor whether in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, but how to be worthy of one's suffering. Some 10 odd years before, Wu Ningquen drew from his literary readings the strength to survive in the hell of a Maoist labor camp. In Europe, Primo Levi had had a similar experience in Auschwitz, as he recalled it in his classic account of the Nazi death camps, If This Is a Man. He recited from memory a passage from Dante, Divine Comedy, the canto of Ulysses, to a young companion to whom he was teaching some Italian. The effort of this recitation of a few stanzas was, I quote, as if I also was hearing it for the first time, like the blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God. For a moment, I forget who I am and where I am. What Dante sang had to do with all men who suffer, and with us in particular. I need not read again the entire page to you. I'm sure it is still in our memories. This episode, evoked by Levi, was so momentous that 30 years later, the year before he died, he returned to it in the last book he wrote, The Drowned and the Saved. Summing up his experience of the camp, he concluded, culture was important to me, and perhaps it saved me. In Auschwitz, the half-remembered, half-forgotten lines had become literally priceless. In that place at that moment, the very survival of Levi's humanity was dependent on it. Again, it verifies Randall Jarrell's axiom. Without literature, human life is animal life. In the light of these testimonies, let us consider now the function that can be performed by literary criticism. Literary criticism, it seems to me, can fulfill two functions. The first one, which is very difficult and dangerous, it requires great talent, intelligence, inspiration and sensitivity, imagination and sensitivity, and very often is best practiced not only by professional critics, but also, first and foremost, by creative writers. This first function is a function of interpretation. The second function, though more humble and pedestrian, is also of considerable use. It is simply a function of information. Now, first, this interpretative criticism. To my mind, its best definition was provided by two creative geniuses. Note again, quite often, the best critics are themselves great writers. First, Chesterton, who was also a superb literary critic. I quote, "The function of criticism, if it has a legitimate function at all, can only be one function, that of dealing with the subconscious part of the author's mind, which only the critic can express, and not with the conscious part of the author's mind, which the author himself can express. Either criticism is no good at all, a very defensible position, or else criticism means saying about an author the very thing that would have made him jump out of its boots." Which I would complete with a quote from D.H. Lawrence, again, a creative writer who was also a masterly critic. "Never trust the artist, trust the tale. The proper function of a critic is to save the tale from the artist who wrote it." These two statements contain one and paradoxical conclusion. The greatest creators in world literature literally do not necessarily know what they are doing. They may intend to do one thing, but what they actually achieve may be quite different, as perceptive critics will point out. For instance, in writing the most universal masterpiece of world literature, Don Quixote, Cervantes consciously pursued what was what was merely an idle, narrow, and uninteresting objective, to denounce the foolishness of a certain literary genre of the time, knight-errant stories, an issue that was already quite irrelevant in his own time and has never interested anyone since. Nikolai Gogol, after having written his immortal comic masterpiece, Dead Souls, planned to carry on with the second part. Luckily, death prevented him from completing it. From the surviving fragments of the draft, one can see that it was a humorless sermon that completely negated the inspired spirit of the first part. Gogol did not understand his own masterpiece. In the second part of his long life, Tolstoy came virtually to apologize for having written Anna Karenina. Such activity eventually appeared to him frivolous, if not sinful. And instead of carrying on with similar pursuits, he devoted himself to writing dreary socio-political religious pamphlets and wasted his time becoming the leader of a fanatical sect. One could multiply the examples of great writers not knowing what they do or being mistaken about their true achievements. And this brings us to another problem: the frequent dichotomy between a book and its author, the contrast, the opposition between the writer and the man. In other words, the problem of literary biography. Very often, great writers, with good reason, are weary of literary biographies. They feel that their works alone should be the focus of commentators' attention. For instance, Joseph Brodsky, a biography does not explain one damn thing. Czesław Miłosz, obviously all biographies are false. Biographies are like seashells. Not much can be learned from them about the mollusks that once lived inside them. And George Orwell discouraging someone who wanted to write his biography. Every life viewed from the inside would be a series of defeats, too humiliating to contemplate. V.S. Naipaul, quite lucidly, in the light of what his biography eventually disclosed, everything of value about me is in my books only. The puzzling question posed by the lives of so many great writers are well summarized in one axiom by Paul Valéry. Every individual is inferior to his most beautiful work. Hilaire Belloc explained why. I never knew a man who was consonant with his work when the work is of genius. When the work is of genius, he is far below it. The point of fact is that it is not the mere man who does the thing. It is the man inspired. No man is himself a genius. His genius is lent him from the outside. Georges Bernanos, a writer utterly devoid of conceit, a man genuinely humble and sincere, said about his masterpiece, The Diary of a Country Priest, which is indeed a book of great depth and beauty. I love this book as if it was not written by me. And he added, I am not responsible for what I created. Virtus de illo exhibat. It is a quote from the Gospel. Christ makes a miracle without knowing about it. The woman crippled approached him and touches the garment of his cloak, the fringe of his cloak. And virtus ex illo exhibat, a power came out of him without his own control. So we face the mystery of literary creation when we consider the gap between a book and its author, the contrast, the opposition between the writer and the man. It is a mystery that never ceases to obsess me. I have briefly dealt with it in a short essay on Georges Simenon, included in my latest book. How can one ever explain this contradiction between a work and its author? Greatness of the work, mediocrity of the man. Beauty of the work, vulgarity or downright ugliness of the man. Just one notorious example. The well-known case of Louis-Ferdinand Céline, whose first novel, Voyage au bout de la nuit, Journey to the End of the Night, transformed the 20th century novel and its very language. The same author also wrote anti-Semitic pamphlets, vile and criminal, shortly before the war, at the time of the Nazis' ascendancy. I have one CD devoted to Céline. It embodies incomprehensible contradiction between the artist who is sublime and the man who appears a despicable wretch. On that CD first, a great actor, Michel Simon, reads the first 3 pages of Journey to the End of the Night. Listening to it gives you gooseflesh, the raw impact of pure genius. And then comes a long interview of Céline himself at the end of his life. A miserable rambling of mediocre cliché, utterly devoid of any elementary self-awareness. The intellectual level is that of a Pauline Hanson speech. It is pathetic. In the same line, there is another example, even more extreme. Another French novelist, a few years younger than Céline, Lucien Robatet, author of Les Deux Étendards, Twin Standards, published in 1952, never translated into English. Robatet was a fascist. He collaborated actively with the Nazis during the occupation. And unlike Céline, he did not have the excuse of being half mad. He was a very intelligent and articulate man. At the end of the war, he was arrested and sentenced to death. However, the execution was not carried out. He was eventually released after 7 years in jail. And then he spent the last 20 years of his life in semi-obscurity. But while he was in jail, awaiting execution, he wrote his great novel, a Bildungsroman, that has nothing to do with politics, nor with the war, and is of extraordinary power and beauty. Though the importance of the book is fully acknowledged by all true connoisseurs, it remains still largely ignored, even in France, because of the utterly despicable and vile nature of its author, or the author's earlier activities. And it is totally ignored in the rest of the world. Personally, I confess it was for me one of the most momentous reading experience of a lifetime. As you may naturally distrust my own personal views on such a subject, allow me to invoke here the testimony of an unimpeachable witness, the great cosmopolitan scholar of comparative literature, George Steiner, Franco-Anglo-Swiss American professor and critic. Besides, as Steiner is Jewish, his assessment of the book is particularly impressive and cannot be suspected of any favorable bias. Here is what he wrote of in one of his New Yorker's columns about, I quote, "The dilemma posed by Lucien Robatet is even thornier than the one posed by Céline. Robatet was a true killer, a underdone of Jews, resistance fighters, and Gaullists. Waiting for execution, he was subsequently amnestied, Robatet completed Les Deux Étendards, as yet untranslated into English. This ample novel is among the hidden treasures, the hidden masterpieces of our time. It is, moreover, a book of unfailing humanity, brimful of music. Robatet was for a spell France's foremost music critic. Full of love, of insight into pain. The young woman at the pivot of the tale is no less informed by the radiant pressures of maturing life than is the Natasha of War and Peace. What can possibly give us any intelligible grasp of the connection between the abject, twisted Robatet and the wonders of his fiction? What are the bridges in the labyrinths of this soul? I have no answers. The 19th century French critic Sainte-Beuve believed that to understand the writer, it was necessary to know as much as possible about the exterior man, the details of his life. He believed that the man and the writer are one and the same person. A fuller knowledge of the man should therefore give us a more complete understanding of the writer. A good half-century later, Proust demolished this theory in an essay called Against Sainte-Beuve, exposing with great penetration the difference between the writer as writer and the writer as social being. Proust summed up his position in the following statement. A book is the product of a different self from the self manifest in our habits, in our social life, in our vices. If we would try to understand that particular self, it is by searching our own bosoms and trying to reconstruct it there that we may arrive at it. Proust's theory of the two selves, the creative one, interior and hidden, and the social one, superficial and on display, was not published during his lifetime. It appeared only in 1970. E.M. Forster developed a very similar conception without knowing of Proust's views in a 1925 article entitled Anonymity, an Inquiry. In this remarkable essay, Forster explored the essential duality of the artist's personality. Explored this essential duality of the artist's personality. And I quote Forster here. Each human mind has two personalities, one on the surface, one deeper down. The surface personality is conscious and alert. It does things like dining out, answering letters, etc., and differs vividly and amusingly from other personalities. The deep personality is strange. In some ways, it seems to be a perfect fool. But without it, there is no literature. Because unless a man dips a bucket deep down into it occasionally, he cannot produce first-class work. Work that transcends individual idiosyncrasies and reaches the universal quality to which all great literature tends. This quasi-anonymity of Homer, Cervantes, and Shakespeare. And then more recently, note also that in his 2001 lecture of the Nobel Prize, V.S. Naipaul reaffirmed the central relevance and validity of this theory of the writer's dual personality, which Proust had first expressed in his Against Sainte-Beuve. As I said in the beginning, besides its important, difficult, and subtle function of elucidation and interpretation of literary works, literary criticism also performs a more modest but very useful task of straightforward information. In actual practice, most of the time, it is simply thanks to book reviews that we become aware of the existence of new books that may be of interest to us. As we probably all share the same addiction to reading book reviews, I suppose there is really no need for me to take more of your time by expanding on what is our common experience. I shall merely mention two potential dangers that can result from too great a reliance upon reviews. First, the absence of reviews can have disastrous consequences. And second, we can be misled by talented reviewers. First point, la conspiration du silence. Good books can be killed, great writers can be buried, at least for a time, by the silence of the critics. A sort of censorship is thus exerted. Now for aesthetic reasons, sometimes for aesthetic reasons, and sometimes for out of political ideological prejudice. For instance, in the 19th century France, writers such as Stendhal and Baudelaire never enjoyed due recognition during their lives, since the leading literary critics of the time ignored them because they offended the taste of the time. As for political ideological censorship closer to us, consider the case of Orwell. His Homage to Catalonia, a literary masterpiece and one of the most moving testimonies on the Spanish Civil War. But being a truthful book, it offended both the political right and the political left, which surrounded it with a wall of silence. The original edition, published in 1938, was of only 1,500 copies. 13 years later, in 1951, 1 year after Orwell's death, this tiny edition was still partly unsold. So this sort of censorship by silence can be frightfully effective. Then another problem, one can be misled by book reviewers, especially when they are very talented. Here I confess just a personal experience of 2 months ago. As you might guess, I'm very interested and fond of Chesterton. And I learned that a new biography of Chesterton has just appeared. And the first review of that new biography was published in The Spectator, which always has a good section on book reviews. And the author of the book review was A.N. Wilson. A.N. Wilson is a novelist, I confess, and read his novels, but also a remarkable literary biographer. His biographies of Tolstoy, of C.S. Lewis, of Hilaire Belloc, and even of Iris Murdoch are absolutely remarkable. So here I am confronted with a new book on Chesterton. The author of that book is Ian Kerr, a scholar who had written a monumental biography of John Henry Newman a few years ago. And no, the book is being reviewed by Ian Wilson. Most impressive. You will really trust such a reviewer. The review of the book was scathing. Exposed the book, the biographer, as incompetent and rather naive and dumb. It really puts off my idea of getting hold of the book. I gave it up. But then a few weeks later, in a very good American weekly magazine, which has an excellent section on culture, books and films, I read another review of the same book, a glowing review. I said, the book is remarkable. So I am puzzled. I bought the book. And indeed, the book is the best biography of Chesterton to date. It's superbly researched. It's extremely detailed. You're fully informed. It's really a must, indispensable for anyone interested in the subject. Now, my question is, the reviewer Ian Wilson, which I trust on the basis of his magnificent work as a literary biographer, is a good writer, perceptive writer, obviously has a personal bias against Chesterton and perhaps also against Goethe for psychological reasons, which are totally... But the result is that the more talented, the more impressive the reviewer, the more misleading his conclusion may be sometimes. It's always useful to check and counter-check. This being said, as I think all of us here, you wouldn't have come otherwise, share the same addiction, both to reading book reviews and to reading literary biographies. And I think they are very healthy addictions. In the end now, just one last little note on a particular issue. What is the attitude of writers towards reviews of their own works? Many writers insist that, first, they learn nothing from the criticism of their reviewers, and second, that they don't even bother reading them. My own feeling is that on the first point, they are probably right. But on the second point, I think they do not tell the truth. And here, Norman Mailer dealt with this question with disarming frankness in The Spooky Art, a book about his experience as a writer. I quote, "I would never dream of not reading reviews of my books. It would be like not looking at a naked woman if she happens to be standing in front of an open window. Whether ugly or lovely, she's undeniably interesting under such circumstances." This seems to me a very honest acknowledgement of fact. Thank you for your patience.